Welcome everyone to this week's edition of Elections Weekly. I'm your host, Eric Cunningham, and this week we've got two guests with us. We've got Dylan Wade, who has been on the podcast several times. We've also got Dane Hammond, who recently has written some good articles for Elections Daily as well. What we're going to do today is we're going to kind of go over two main topics in this edition of the podcast. We're going to go over the primary results that happened on Tuesday, where we saw several incumbents lose. And we're also going to go over the Tennessee primaries, which are actually the polls close at 8 o'clock for those. So we're going to go over what those might mean. The Senate race there between Bill Hagerty and Manny Sethi on the Republican primary. So we got a good show on us today, but I'm going to start out with the Tuesday primaries here. So if you followed our election live stream, you'll notice there were several results that kind of surprised people. Probably the biggest surprise was obviously the primary defeat of Lacy Clay by incumbent progressive challenger Cori Bush in Missouri's 1st congressional district based in St. Louis. But there was also another election which was surprisingly large in magnitude as well, which was Kris Kobach not only losing the Republican nomination in the Kansas Senate race on the Republican side, but also getting utterly demolished by Roger Marshall, who pretty much had a decisive advantage in almost all of the state. So I guess I'll kind of throw it to Dylan first to kind of talk about that big win for Cori Bush in the 1st congressional district in Missouri.
Yeah, that was one even I didn't expect. I expected her to lose by a small margin, single digits, but mainly because of how strong an incumbent Lacy Clay is. He's kind of a central figure in the district, and beating a member of the Congressional Black Caucus when they see you coming is kind of difficult, as we saw with Morgan Harper losing to Joyce Beatty in Ohio. So this is a big statement for the progressive left. Really shows that they're here to stay in a lot of ways, and they can expand even beyond just majority-minority districts with white incumbents.
And this is really shots fired at the Congressional Black Caucus, which has long resisted efforts to primary its incumbents. Lacy Clay is obviously not only an incumbent, but an entrenched incumbent. He had represented that district for decades, but also his father had represented the district for decades before him. So what we saw here was kind of a really surprising result, and it was kind of bolstered by the city of St. Louis, which voted for Cori Bush by a very large margin of around 10 percentage points in the city, whereas in the county, Lacy Clay had a smaller advantage of 3 percentage points. Normally, you can survive in that district by just winning the county portion, which is larger, but that margin of victory in the county or the city was kind of what pushed Cori Bush over the edge. Do you have any thoughts on that election, Dane?
One thing that I noticed, it was one of the maps that I saw in my feed, but I can't quite remember who published it. But one thing that is noteworthy is that Lacy Clay seemed to do better in the northern half of St. Louis, while Cori Bush did better in the southern half.
Yep, in the northern half of St. Louis, it's about 300,000 people are in the city of St. Louis. The northern portion is predominantly black, while the southern portion has a larger population of white voters. And so in the Democratic primary there, that was kind of a major divide there that enabled Cori Bush to be able to overcome the primary. To be clear, both of the candidates here are black. So Cori Bush is African American, like Lacy Clay. So it wasn't necessarily a racial divide, more of the higher proportion of black Americans are based in that area, the more likely they were to vote for Lacy Clay.
Right. And older black voters tend to be slightly more conservative than the average Democratic voter. What I thought was really striking about the primary was the difference in the absentee and early ballots and the same day votes. Cori Bush outperformed the absentees by, I believe, 20 points, which is more than, I think that's the biggest margin of the midterm, besides maybe Nate McMurray in New York's 27th.
Yeah, it was a really surprising result overall. Most outlets called it early on, including us, for Lacy Clay because of that strong margin that we're seeing there, that we saw early on. But as the later votes came in, Cori Bush was able to turn it around everywhere, not just in the city, but also in the county. And the city, it's worth noting that city portion had voted for many years. Its representative was Mel Carnahan, who was a Democrat. His district stretched from the city of St. Louis, the southern portion of it, into some of the rural and exurban areas outside the city. And his district was dismantled following the 2020 or 2010 census after they lost a congressional district, which resulted in him losing a seat. Lacy Clay was able to convince everyone there to keep a seat predominantly African American and incorporate the entire city as well as the most African American portions of St. Louis County, which resulted in the Carnahan seat being just dismantled.
It is kind of a poetic justice in a strange way that Lacy Clay built that seat for himself, and he probably wouldn't have lost if it were a different seat.
Yeah, and it's worth noting it's not a gerrymandered seat per se. I've seen some people saying that the map that was drawn was a gerrymander. It wasn't a gerrymander, but but Lacy Clay did lobby hard to keep his district at the expense of Mel Carnahan, who resided in the southern portion of the city, which was ultimately resulted in the primary between the two, where he won by virtue of it being, Russ Carnahan, not Mel Carnahan. Russ Cunningham was able to conduct a primary challenge, but lost it 2-1, fairly along racial lines in that district.
Yeah. No, I think this is a really big statement for the left. It opens up their options for where they can go from here.
Definitely.
They no longer have to stick to those majority-minority districts if they have a good enough candidate. And Cori Bush was a very good candidate.
And she was able to conduct a primary challenge last cycle that was unsuccessful, which was kind of why people had written her off this time. But it is interesting to see a Congressional Black Caucus member be defeated in a race like this for, I think, the first time in quite a while.
Yeah, and it's not like it's not like Elliot Engel or Joe Crowley where they didn't see the primary challenger coming. Lacy Clay saw it coming. He had been preparing for it. He had been putting out attack ads as you should in a campaign, but he had taken it very seriously, and he still lost. But no, what I think is relevant about the fact that she did run last cycle and lost, she did, but she ran on a very shoestring budget and still managed to get 30% of the vote. So I think that should have been the first clue that maybe there was something more to this.
Definitely, and obviously the district is safely Democratic. The city of St. Louis is particularly liberal, but the portion of the county is also liberal. This isn't a seat that is going to be flipping. This is a very safe win and another addition to not just the Congressional Black Caucus, but also the more social democratic wing of the party.
Yeah, you actually might have enough now to have a caucus of just the Justice Democrats.
Yeah. Do you have any additional thoughts on this before we move on to the next race?
No.
Dane?
Not really. One thing that I wanted to point out is I think that like the second chance candidates, the ones who ran in 2018 and are running again this year, one thing that seems to be paramount is that they already have that campaign like infrastructure up. Since Marie Newman, she did pretty well in 2018 and ended up beating Dan Lipinski this year.
Yeah,
and part of me wonders how much of that is similar to Cori Bush's victory over Lacy Clay.
Yeah, there are a lot of advantages to those second chance candidates. I think you're going to see that with Cisneros next cycle. They can build their name recognition. They can build that infrastructure. Yeah, definitely.
And so we want to welcome Harrison Lavelle onto the podcast, who was fortunate enough to have his internet restored today after several days of being knocked out by the hurricane, including during our election coverage. So we're excited to have Harrison on. We were just going over the Missouri 1st Congressional District primary, the shocker in that race. We were just talking about, in particular, the second chance candidates, people who were running a second time after a strong challenge the first time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth looking at. I mean, when I wrote the article about Lacy Clay and we went over that race, we still ranked that race actually as likely Clay. But one thing that I made sure to note in the article was that there was a strong possibility that the race could be competitive, meaning within 5 points or so. And I kind of saw that possibility because for an incumbent, Clay wasn't that strong of a fundraiser, which normally would make sense because Clay's in a safe seat and he normally doesn't have primary opposition, and the primary is essentially tantamount to the general election there. So we definitely gave it a thought about it being closer. I mean, Cori Bush did fairly well last time, considering she came out of the blue and got 37%. You know, losing to 20% by 20%, that's a big margin, but against someone who's been there as long as Clay and whose father represented the district for another 30 years before him, I thought it was a pretty good performance. And this time she came around and she managed to win despite being down quite significantly early on the election night. And even though I couldn't really fully analyze results until today, looking at the result, I mean, if you look at the divergence, actually someone posted a precinct map of the different precincts, and Bush's support was definitely stronger in some of the wards in the southern half of St. Louis City, and Clay held traditional support in the northern half. But yeah, I mean, it was an upset, and it was interesting to see two incumbent representatives defeated on 2 days in their primaries. And I think it's certainly something worth noting that, as Kyle Kondik has said repeatedly, this is the highest number of incumbents, 7 now, that have lost their primaries since in a non-redistricting year since 1974. Previously, it was 1980. Now we've already eclipsed that, and there are still competitive primaries going on, even in the Senate. A chance for Ed Markey to lose as an incumbent. So this is definitely not a very good year for incumbents in general. And I think that Cori Bush ran a successful campaign, and I think everything surrounding the George Floyd incident probably ended up helping her in that election. And I think that she is a perfect example of how a second-time candidate can come around and pull off quite surprising upset in that race. And another piece of trivia, Cori Bush in 2018 actually performed better or lost by a smaller margin than Russ Carnahan did when he was drawn into that district, which included virtually none of the territory of his old 3rd district. So it's worth noting.
Yeah. It's definitely not a result we saw coming, but it is a result that we were aware of the possibility of. I mean, definitely it's a fascinating result. You know, for the future of the progressive movement and for Justice Democrats, they're going to want to win more challenges like this in safe districts.
When I had done my preview of the race last night on my podcast, I had actually said, look, this is probably going to be a Clay victory, but I think it could flip. I didn't expect it, though. This is a better result for the left than even someone as optimistic as me would have guessed.
Yeah. It's really hard to not see this as anything but an unqualified success for progressive Democrats. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the other races that happened on Tuesday. Probably the biggest one was the Kris Kobach defeat in Kansas. We had rated that race as, I believe, a toss-up in our initial ratings. But I don't think anyone of us saw the possibility of it being a romp like this for Roger Marshall. I'm going to pull up the map here from the New York Times to show you what this really looked like. If you tuned into our election coverage that night, we specifically mentioned why the 2nd Congressional District area was so important here, which is that it was where Kris Kobach had done very well in the 2018 gubernatorial primary. But you'll notice this time, not only did he do pretty poorly in there, he won most of these counties, but a lot of them he bled to Bob Hamilton, for example, Leavenworth County, Atchison, Lynn, Miami, Franklin, Anderson. All these were counties that voted in the last election, 2018, his last primary for Kris Kobach. This time they voted for Bob Hamilton, who seemed to draw votes away from Kobach. Additionally, Roger Marshall did very well in areas like Johnson County, but specifically in his congressional district. I believe J. Miles Coleman did a map earlier on this and found he almost won a majority of the vote in his congressional district in a multi-candidate primary. So really, this is just a decisive margin of victory for Kris Kobach, or for Roger Marshall, and not a great night for Kris Kobach, who's hoping to kind of bring a more populist, Trump-friendly message to the Senate if he could win the race at all, which there were questions if he were able to do that. So I guess I'll lead into you guys' thoughts on what exactly this means. What would you take away from this election?
This is a major defeat for the right-wing populists in the party. And this is a real sigh of relief for Mitch McConnell, I think. Barbara Boye, I never know how to pronounce her last name.
Bollier, yeah.
Okay. She's a great candidate. It's a very red state. It probably wouldn't. It almost certainly won't flip now. But with Kobach, I think there would have been a fairly decent chance that it could flip. So this is one state that McConnell no longer has to really pay much attention to.
And they are spending a little bit of money just to shore up any residual support that would be needed for Marshall, although Kobach has endorsed Marshall, and there doesn't seem to be any risk of a fracture there, aside from some very internet famous populists who are very angry at this result, and specifically at the voters in particular. If you saw some of my tweets, they were some of them including the people at American Greatness, some other outlets that were aggressively pushing for Kris Kobach because of his positions on trade, on immigration. And after Jeff Sessions' defeat in the Alabama Senate runoff, this is kind of 2 losses in a row, which will lead later tonight into what we're talking about with the Haggerty-Sethi race, which is another example of a primary like this. But I'm going to throw in here is that what I found interesting is that this is kind of following along the historical lines in Kansas, right? 3 major senators just in the last 50 years or so have come from that first congressional district. You had Jerry Moran, you had Pat Roberts, and Bob Dole. All came from that rural western district that stretches into most of the state. It definitely gave him over the edge here, and it was in fact the area with the most votes of the congressional districts. Obviously, that's a good night for Republicans there. The 2nd congressional district primary as well was another good result for Republicans. Steve Watkins, the incumbent Republican, who has been dogged by scandal through basically his entire political career, was defeated in his primary, which basically puts the docket on Democratic attempts to win over the 2nd congressional district as well. So for Republicans overall, and especially establishment-friendly Republicans or Republicans who like winning races, it was a really good night on Tuesday, I would say.
Yeah, that Kansas 2nd result. I mean, the Kansas Republican Party has to be feeling really good right now.
And on top of that, they got rid of, this wasn't some sort of revolt against conservatives. At the down ballot level, in fact, many Republicans in the moderate wing of the party who have been more willing to vote with Democrats on a lot of or most issues were defeated in their primaries by more conservative challengers all across the state. So this wasn't some sort of decision by voters that they're rejecting conservatism. This is a decision by voters that they're rejecting candidates that they don't think can win.
I think when you're looking at the Kansas Senate race and the Kansas 2nd congressional district race, the 2 Republican primaries, first off, I think you guys both brought up some really good points about the Kansas Senate primary. Roger Marshall definitely performed better than a lot of people seem to have expected him to do. But we have to remember that Republican senators from Kansas have a pedigree of coming from the 1st congressional district. And I liked what my friend Armin Thomas said on a call I did with him. He was basically talking about how the 1st congressional district is almost like a mini Kansas.
Yep.
And it kind of has its way of grasping into all of the different media markets, because the 1st district coincides on its very far edge, even with some of the distant media markets that would be associated with Kansas City and as well with Topeka. So we definitely saw Marshall do that. He almost won a majority of the vote. He had a very high plurality, close to a majority in his congressional district, which is very impressive. And if you look at the county results, his weakest district was actually probably the 2nd district. I remember Miles posted a map. I didn't get to look at it yet, but Marshall actually won the 3rd district, which I thought was very impressive. So a lot of people were talking about how Marshall didn't advertise in the 3rd district, yet he still won Johnson County, which makes up quite a significant portion of that district. He won it by almost full 10-point margin, which was pretty solid there. But, Republicans are definitely sighing relief right now, especially Mitch McConnell, Pat Roberts, who endorsed Marshall to succeed him. And the only person probably who's not happy about this result are Senate Democrats and Barbara Bollier, because they know that Marshall is objectively a stronger candidate than Kobach, and that Kansas is less likely to vote for Democrats at a statewide level when you're talking about a federal race than it would be for a gubernatorial race like 2018's gubernatorial.
And even then, they weren't able to grasp a majority in that 2018 race.
Yeah.
They went with a plurality of the vote.
Yeah, so it's certainly worth noting that even though Barbara Bollier is strongly ahead of even Roger Marshall when it comes to cash on hand and fundraising, I think Marshall will be able to catch up and use his pedigree as a representative from the 1st District to springboard into the U.S. Senate this November, probably by a fairly comfortable margin. He's a conservative, but he's not a controversial conservative. And because of that, I think he'll be able to, he's going to be able to probably win in November without that much difficulty. I would say a likely Republican rating is merited here for this Senate race. I mean, I know that Crystal Ball and a lot of prominent forecasters, us as well, we're probably going to move that race to leans Republican if Kobach is nominee. Mm-hmm. But if you look at it objectively, wherever you are in the country nowadays, it's always going to be harder to win a Senate race than it is a gubernatorial race if you're a candidate that is, for example, someone who is not registered with the party that the majority of that state's voters are. So to put it simply, it would be a lot easier for Laura Kelly to win against Kris Kobach in a gubernatorial race that was still winnable for Republicans in a blue wave than it would be if, say, Laura Kelly decided to run for Senate and against Jerry Moran in 2022. She probably wouldn't win. I mean, it's just unlikely. There are plenty of examples. Look at Louisiana with John Bel Edwards as governor. And even then in 2014, a year before he was elected, Mary Landrieu was voted out pretty resoundingly. Or Andy Beshear, who managed to win the governor's mansion there in 2019, just a few short years after Rand Paul was reelected as senator. So you do have exceptions. You do have cases where you have senators in red states from the opposite party, like Joe Manchin in West Virginia and John Tester in Montana. But for the most part, it's more difficult. And I think that plays into this Kansas Senate race. And I think that national Republicans convincing President Trump to not endorse Kobach, but rather not endorse anyone in this race, definitely didn't help anyone, but it definitely hurt Kobach, considering how instrumental Trump was to turning out those more conservative voters who are partial to Kobach's campaign when he beat Governor Collier in the primary last year. And looking at the one last thing about the Senate race is Bob Hamilton. I think a lot of people expected Hamilton to pull votes away from Marshall, but from everything that it looks like, he pulled votes away, especially in the 2nd congressional district, from Kris Kobach, and that definitely hurt him because that was the
second and the third. Because
well.
Kobach actually won. He won the
Wyandotte County by 3 votes, but he would have probably won Johnson. If it wasn't for Hamilton, he probably would have won Johnson County too. So, I mean, Hamilton's impact on the race is certainly well defined in that regard. And then the second one is in the 2nd district in Kansas. You had Congressman Steve Watkins. You had him lose to LaTurner, and we ranked this race as lean LaTurner. So this was one that was much more expected versus Lacy Clay's loss, which arguably some people thought Rashida Tlaib would have a better chance of losing than Lacy Clay. But hey, it's hard to predict some of these primary races without polling. But Watkins was definitely one that we saw coming. I mean, he as I said before, he's never really been someone who's been clean of scandal. I mean, since he first started running back in 2018, he was accused of sexual assault from his military service record in the past. And even though no allegations or nothing came to fruition from that, he was still an underdog in the Republican district held by Lynn Jenkins when he ran against Paul Davis. And it was an open seat in that election, and Davis was expected to win, and he lost. He almost won, but he lost by about 0.8%. So really close loss right there. And you effectively had a congressman who won a district without a majority of the vote, never really had a full mandate while serving in office. And it slowly spiraled off from there. I mean, you had the rumors that he would resign for undisclosed reasons that he had to deny. And you had a strong challenger in Jake LaTurner, the Kansas state auditor, who was being pushed by Republicans like Jeff Collier and other members of the Kansas Republican Party to challenge Steve Watkins. It was almost like he was being pushed out by national and state Republicans. I mean, another notable figure that didn't ever come in to back Watkins at the last minute was President Trump. He did have a fundraiser with Mike Pence last September, but Pence has not made any more appearances for him this year. And the real bombshell that probably ended the campaign for Watkins as an incumbent was definitely the voter fraud charges that he argued were politically motivated that were delivered by the Shawnee County District Attorney. 3 counts, and his father is being investigated as well. That was really the final straw for him. And even though he technically had a fundraising lead over LaTurner had a cash on hand advantage. I think that helped as well in this campaign. And at the end of the day, Watkins only won 2 counties. He won Brown County and Lynn County, both of which by relatively narrow margins. And in terms of Shawnee County, where you obviously have Topeka, the largest city in the district, Watkins lost that by about 3,000 votes. So that was not good. And he ended up losing all votes totaled by 15 points. And that's a pretty big deficit. The only incumbent in this cycle to lose by a bigger margin was Elliot Engel, who lost by a pretty large margin. I think right now it's around the same. I think it's around 60-40 or 57-40 or something like that. Elliot Engel was below 40, but I believe with absentees counted, he actually trickled up to 40, but I'd have to check. But, there was a clear defining mandate by the voters to some extent against Watkins. I mean, LaTurner fell just a few points short of getting a majority of the vote. And that means pretty much half of the Republicans in the district, or more than that, over 2/3 of the Republicans in the district, aka the voters who voted for LaTurner or third place finisher Dennis Taylor, did not view Watkins as deserving of another term in office. And I think this benefits the Republicans going into November because LaTurner, kind of like someone like Marshall, is arguably a stronger candidate. I mean, when you're looking at the race, there was an internal poll, probably biased for the Democrats because of the Republican leanings of the district. But when you're looking at it on paper as a district, it definitely still benefits the Republicans. I mean, Trump won it by 19 last time, and Michelle Disla is going to have trouble winning it this time if a candidate like Paul Davis couldn't win it in 2018, even if the national environment is similar this time. But regardless of the nature of that race, I think that stops the race from moving from likely to lean Republican for a lot of pundits. And just like Republicans on the Senate level are kind of sighing in relief that someone like Kobach didn't lock up the Senate nomination there, congressional Republicans, probably the people at the NRCC, are probably glad to see Watkins go, which is not something you typically say of an incumbent because usually incumbents are challenged by people that are kind of running from a fringe, a side, or without tested experience. But in this case, I think people knew that LaTurner was a stronger candidate and that Republican chances of holding the seat are improved by his victory, for sure.
Yeah. And definitely one thing to note, I do want to make one minor correction, is that Jake LaTurner was the treasurer of the state, not the auditor, although it's worth noting he was very young when he was elected. He was actually the youngest elected statewide officer in the United States. He's only 32 years old, so he's got a pretty good career set in front of him. The reason
sorry about that slip up there. I mean, the two offices are very similar. I mean, in some states they're combined into one office. So.
Yeah, well, not North Carolina or in Kansas, apparently.
Well, whatever. I apologize to the viewers for my.
No, it's all right. But what I was going to mention is that the Bob Hamilton factor, to me, it really looked like it took a big chunk out of Kobach's support because the way he won in 2018 was with a coalition in the eastern portion of the state. He actually won the county that Kansas City is located in. He won it by a decent margin. He won a lot of those counties in the 2nd Congressional District. So to see Marshall not only win every county in his district, but also most of the ones near his district and all of Wichita area, and only really struggle in that eastern Kansas portion. After all, Kobach is from the 3rd Congressional District area. He ran for Congress in the 3rd Congressional District and lost a while back when the Democratic incumbent was another representative. But short of an election where they had a strong challenger to Sharice Davids, this is basically the best result Kansas Republicans could have asked for. They shored up their support, getting rid of the moderate wing of the party that would have voted for some of Laura Kelly's policy objectives. They got rid of Steve Watkins, who was a walking news story and a seeming walking scandal generator. And they got rid of Kris Kobach, who was at risk of losing the district. In hindsight, to me, that $5 million that the Sunflower State PAC spent in Kansas seems more like desperation than it did an actual confidence.
It was a good night for Republicans in Kansas on the simplest level, not for the far right populist wing of the party, But certainly, when you're looking at mainstream Republicans in Kansas that want to be as electorally viable as possible, it was a good
Yeah.
night.
Yeah, and it's worth it. Roger Marshall is not a moderate. People say he's a moderate. They
No,
mean
he's
he's
not. He's a
establishment.
conservative, but it's like what I
Mhm.
said. Kind of like his neighbor in Congress down to the south in Oklahoma's third, Frank Lucas. They're conservatives, and they're decidedly conservatives, but they have a focus on issues that matter to the districts, and they're not bomb throwers.
Mhm.
They're not controversial figures like a conservative like Matt Gaetz, for example. They're much more policy oriented, working on getting things done for their district, typically on agricultural issues. So yeah, it's important to know they aren't moderates, they are conservatives, but uh, they're to a degree they're sometimes more sensible than some colleagues that can draw the ire of more liberal opponents, which obviously don't play a role in their congressional districts. But one thing
Mhm.
I also want to note before we move on to the next segment is because of the vacancy, if LaTurner wins in November, Governor Kelly would be able to appoint a new treasurer to the office, who would have to stand for election when in 2022, I believe, when the new row offices would be up for election with the governorship. Now, Kansas is a red state, so it would be unlikely that they would hold it against a normal opponent. But we have seen elections for row offices in red states, particularly in neighboring Missouri, where appointed incumbents have successfully won re-election. Like
Mhm.
Nicole Galloway, who's running for governor, beat McDowell. And Sandra McDowell, granted, was not the best candidate, had some ethical issues, but it's possible. So I think it's worth noting. And it'll be interesting to see how well the appointed incumbent performs. And I'm not sure if Kansas has rules where you have to appoint a row officer that is of the same party as the one that resigned. But if not, it would be interesting to see how a Democratic appointed incumbent fares going
Mhm.
forward.
Definitely. And one more thing I want to note before we go into our next segment is I'm actually since we took up a lot of time talking about Kansas and the general discussion with Tennessee is going to revolve more around what the future of the Republican Party might look like, which is kind of a struggle that we're seeing in the Kansas or the Tennessee Senate primary. I'm going to shift some of the discussion of a couple of our primaries, mainly the Arizona Senate primary, which had some interesting results in the South, into that next segment, which will be after the commercial break. I do want to mention a few other results before we go into the commercial break, which will last about a minute. It's not going to be too long for you guys. In the third congressional district, Peter Mayer had a resounding victory in the Republican primary, winning with over 50% of the vote. I know even Democrats who I'm in contact with several Democrats who genuinely like him as a candidate and think he's a genuinely nice guy. His family runs the grocery chain. He rather than campaigning during coronavirus, a lot of it he was spending time giving his staff, delivering groceries to. Yeah, so he's a rock star recruit for Republicans, in my opinion. That in that district, Joe Szymanski did a great interview with him earlier. In the 6th congressional district, John Hoadley won the Democratic nomination narrowly against a very underfunded Democratic opponent, Jen Richardson. John Hoadley had some opposition research come out on him the night before the election, or the night of the election, actually. And I know for a fact that Republicans are taking that race very seriously. So we'll be paying attention to see how that race goes. The only other one here is Rashida Tlaib managed to hold off Brenda Jones in her primary. She won 66% of the vote, 66% compared to 34% roughly for Brenda Jones, her opponent that she narrowly defeated in the 2016 primary for that district. 2018 primary. Yeah. So with that, we'll go right into the commercial break real quick, and we'll be right back. All right, we're back, and we're going into our next segment now. which will be covering kind of the continuing Republican internal conflict we saw represented in the Kansas Senate primary. First thing I want to mention is in Arizona, many of the populist wing of the party or the extreme pro-Trump wing have been unhappy with Martha McSally's performance as senator. You've seen in recent years kind of doomed Senate candidacies like of Kelly Ward multiple times. John McCain had a primary challenger in 2010. This time, the sacrificial lamb was Daniel McCarthy, who ran on a platform that was generally pro-Trump and conservative, although he had some other weird positions, like, for example, supporting the annexing of Mexico, which is a novel solution to the immigration debate. If you just annex Mexico, I guess there's no illegal immigration.
I didn't know that was a position of his.
Yeah, that's a big galaxy brain take from him. But he actually did very well in the areas that Martha McSally represented in the House. So in Cochise County, he won 31% of the vote. He won 33% in Santa Cruz. And in Pima County, which is home to Tucson, he won 32% of the vote. This is compared to 24% statewide, which is pretty typical of a primary challenger in Arizona. So obviously, Martha McSally has been having some difficulties in her Senate race, not with fundraising. She's actually been pretty good at that, although lagging behind Mark Kelly, who is raising presidential level numbers. But what do you guys think about what this kind of means? Is specifically these sorts of areas have been trending away from Republicans for a while, right? We saw in the Republican presidential primary that Donald Trump did very well in a lot of urban areas that don't have a lot of Republicans. Even in the Kansas Senate primary, Kris Kobach was able to win the county that Kansas City is located in, which is the largest, most Democratic area in the state. So I don't know if you guys think this has any long-term meaning. I just thought it was kind of interesting to see that internal division play out specifically on the southern border adjacent counties.
Yeah, I think it sort of speaks to the discontent that Republicans seem to have with Martha McSally in particular. She doesn't ever seem to get the full support of Republicans. She didn't get, I believe she lagged behind in terms of Republican support in the 2018 midterm against Sinema. And she's almost certainly going to underperform Mark Kelly's margin with Democrats that she would with Republicans. So McCarthy may have gotten a comparable margin, but he called for the annexation of Mexico. He shouldn't have gotten it 24% statewide.
Yeah, and for sure. And I think the big thing for me is that it kind of reveals kind of a discontent with who Martha McSally actually is as a candidate. She won as a House representative, and she won very successfully in a Democratic-leaning district or Democratic trending one as a very moderate person, someone on the Republican wing that would be comparable to a Kristen Sinema. But when she ran for Senate, she's had to increasingly position herself with the Trump wing of the party, and specifically with Donald Trump himself, which has created an identity crisis. You know, conservatives, clearly the core, the furthest right wing of the Arizona Republican Party, clearly doesn't trust her. They don't believe she's as conservative as she says she is, as pro-Trump as she says she is. But also clearly the moderate voters, they're flocking to Mark Kelly, and they flock to Kristen Sinema. They don't seem to believe this transformation either, and if they do, they don't like it. We've seen a similar thing in the Tennessee Senate primary. So the reason I wanted to talk about that is we're seeing a similar conflict here in Tennessee. You have two different candidates here, both of which are trying to vie for the Trump support. So Bill Hagerty is endorsed by most Republicans in the state. He's endorsed by Marsha Blackburn, endorsed by Nikki Haley. Donald Trump endorsed him. Jeb Bush, Bill Haslam, Students for Trump, Chamber of Commerce, pretty universal support for Hagerty across all of the Republican Party's wings, except for the furthest right wing of the party, who are going after him specifically for his past support of Mitt Romney. Not notably when Mitt Romney was impeaching Trump, but when Mitt Romney was a presidential candidate in 2000 and 2012, and also his praise for him when after the 2016 election. This has kind of flocked to Manny Sethi, who has received the support of Jim DeMint, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Alan Keynes, lots of the very aggressive, more pro-Trump wings of the Republican Party. And so now you're seeing Hagerty actually return a campaign donation check that was offered to him by Mitt Romney. So tonight, this race, the polls close tonight, August 6th at 8:00 p.m. And we track the results on our Twitter account for those of you following along live.
We'll have graphics too tonight.
Yeah, because Harrison has internet access now. He can successfully make graphics. There's other races we're following in Tennessee as well. But I want to throw it to, I guess, Dane, Harrison, any of you guys, what do you think this kind of shows about the Republican Party at the moment? In a state like Tennessee, where they've traditionally had, it's similar to Kansas, their senators have traditionally been not only affable, but national figures, people like Bill Frist, like Fred Thompson, and on the Democratic side, like Al Gore. They've not really been flamethrower senators. And when Fred Thompson is your biggest definition of a flamethrower, it's not really like it's not really that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dane.
Yeah.
Well, none of these seem to be really that big of a national figures. Like Hagerty was in Trump's cabinet, and that's probably what's been fast tracking him to the Senate seat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for the large part, until Manny Sethi really started to show up. But
yeah, I think this just kind of shows that most of the party is kind of, for all of Trump's bluster about how he is very anti-establishment, when you look back through his endorsements, I mean, he endorsed Luther Strange, and now he's endorsed the more establishment candidate here. So, I mean, the pro-Trump wing of the party is more anti-establishment than the guy that they are supporting.
Mm-hmm. And to be clear, Ted Cruz, for example, has specifically said that the establishment is trying to convince you that Bill Hagerty is the conservative candidate when it's actually Manny Sethi.
They're
Manny
both
Sethi's
very conservative candidates.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's something we have to note to the viewers. They're not like Lamar Alexander and Bob Corker, who are very much the calm and relaxed Senate duo that has represented Tennessee for a very, very long time. And obviously Corker retired and left the Senate in 2019. But Blackburn is definitely a definition of that new, more acerbic right-wing senator from Tennessee, kind of a new Republican style of being a senator from Tennessee. And I think Hagerty fits that same mold. I mean, Hagerty was talking about blowing up Mount Rushmore and putting President Trump on Mount Rushmore. So I mean, Tennessee is a conservative state with conservative Republicans, and there's nothing wrong with being a conservative Republican. I'm just saying that just because someone isn't fringe enough doesn't mean they're not conservative. I think that's a bad attack. And both Sethi and Hagerty are conservative, and it'll be interesting to see if Hagerty's Trump connections manage to convince voters that he should be their next senator in this primary, because Sethi has definitely come out of nowhere in a way and has turned this into a competitive race. And I think it could be a very close race tonight. I think it's going to be very interesting to see where the support's going to come from. Who's going to dominate and rule Tennessee? Could it be an example of suburban voters actually deciding to back the more conservative candidate in Sethi and some of the rural voters voting for Hagerty? That sometimes happens. But it's going to be a very interesting primary to watch. And I think it does show the direction of the Republican Party in a way, because when you look back at Bill Frist, I mean, Sethi has a different style than Bill Frist. That's something to note for sure. But they both started off as physicians without any political experience or political backgrounds. I mean, Bill Frist, when he was elected over Jim Sasser in the 1994 Senate race, and Sasser was a very prominent Democratic senator at the time, he had never voted before in his life. And he was just a heart surgeon from a Nashville, very well-known Nashville family. And he managed to turn that into a record that could beat Sasser in November in the red wave. Now, granted, the national environment doesn't make this seem like a red wave, but it also is important to note that Tennessee is not a swing state with Democratic leanings like it was back then, at least on the congressional level and the presidential level. Nowadays, Tennessee is a firmly Republican state. Even someone like Phil Bredesen couldn't defeat Marsha Blackburn in 2018, despite favorable polling that at some point showed him ahead. So the Republican primary here is going to be the deciding factor in the race, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see which way the voters turn. And could Manny Sethi end up becoming, in a way, the next Bill Frist, someone rising with no political background to become politically prominent? We don't know. I mean, it's kind of like Ronnie Jackson. We don't know how successful he will be or how far he'll go as a congressman. So we don't know for sure if Sethi wins tonight how far he'll go as a senator. But it's going to be interesting to watch because he's young and he is conservative, and it's possible that he does fit a lot of the electorate in Tennessee very well.
Mhm.
But
He's
but
in
then
his
again,
40s.
so does Haggerty, and it's going to be interesting to see how this race plays out tonight in the primary, specifically how different regions of the state vote. I think it's going to be it could potentially be closer than the Kansas Senate primary, which wasn't entirely close, or it could be a wide margin for a candidate in one direction. We're gonna have to wait and see.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I want to mention is that we had a comment from Ehab Alusani, who's an Elections Daily contributor, that said the county to look at will be Williamson County, which is a Nashville suburb. It's actually, if I recall right, the county where Marsha Blackburn came from. And in Tennessee, historically, the suburban counties around Nashville have been the conservative base, whereas the Nashville itself has been where a lot of the establishment sort of Republicans have come from.
Yeah, I think that I'm sorry, the name, not Bill Haggerty.
Manny Setti.
Manny Setti, I'm sorry. I think him being a physician will probably help during this, more with the more moderate voters. That might actually hurt him with the more conservative rural voters, though.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
in theory, but he's also been
important to note.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to bring up, it's important to note that just because he's a physician doesn't necessarily mean that he's abiding by the CDC guidelines. I mean, he's been criticized for not wearing a mask and appearing at a rally where someone tested positive. So, I mean, I don't know for sure if being a physician will help him in this primary. I mean, I think it's more going to be ideologically who fits the coalitions more, and in terms of being a voter, which candidate on the basic level appeals most to you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And because this is very similar to the Massachusetts Senate primary, right? There's very little daylight in terms of policy between what Manny Setti supports and what Bill Haggerty supports. Although, for example, on some issues, Haggerty is deceptively moderate. He put out a policy agenda on how to counter China, the rise of China, but it doesn't mention the word tariff once. It talks about other things that can be done. So,
I mean, it's clear it's clear this race has been tightening. I mean, if you look at the JMC Analytics poll, just started a 4-point lead for Haggerty, which was very narrow. Mm-hmm. And given the fact that you've got a solid 15 to 20% of voters who are undecided, and the fact that you've got about 10 other minor candidates who are going to be siphoning away a portion of the vote, I mean, the outcome in this, I would say it's a toss-up. I mean, I wouldn't say that Haggerty's leading the polls is enough, given the fact that Setti has definitely been gaining momentum, which generally means he'll end up winning more of the undecided. Usually, if you're gaining the momentum online and that transfers some bit to bringing voters out to vote, that sometimes is a good indicator of you taking more of the undecided vote than your opponent, which could be enough to win when your polling lead or deficit is under the margin of error.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the reason we're paying attention to this, obviously, the race we have rated as safe Republican for the actual Senate race. Democrats have not really done very well in presidential years in Tennessee at all, to put it lightly.
Yeah, not in a long time.
Yeah. Now, the candidate they have now is an improvement over some of the previous candidates they've had, who some of them were affiliated, for example, with anti-gay hate groups. They've had very difficult times with recruitments in the Senate, aside from Phil Bredesen. But whoever wins this is not only going to be the senator for Tennessee, but probably will be the senator for quite a while, which is why if Setti wins, it would be very significant because he is in his 40s, similar to when Bill Frist was when he got elected, what Howard Baker was, how some of these other conservatives or Republicans when they won were able to have careers for a long time. Now, obviously, Bill Frist retired after a couple terms, but he could have easily served for much longer than he had. Although Republicans are likely glad he didn't choose to do that, given some of his positions afterwards. But
I mean, sorry, finish it.
No, that was the end of the thought. Yep.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the same thing. I mean, Haggerty's 60, so that definitely means he's if you're 20 years younger than that, you could potentially have 20 years in the Senate that Haggerty hasn't had. So in a way, Haggerty's career has been somewhat lived to an extent already that Setti's hasn't. And there might be some voters who say maybe a younger senator who's more like me, someone who's never really involved themselves in politics before, could bring home some really beneficial things for the state. And again, this is a state with a lot of conservative voters, particularly in the suburbs. To some extent, those voters can sometimes be more conservative than rural voters. But it's definitely worth noting that SETI does have a strong appeal looking at some of these regions. And it's going to be interesting to see how the vote breaks down once we get results by county.
Mm-hmm. And unless anyone else has any additional thoughts, I do want to kind of go into some of these legislative primaries as well. We had a good article that came out earlier this week on some of the races to look for tonight.
I'm thinking about this Tennessee Senate race from a county view, and part of me wonders if Hagerty could do well in Williamson and still lose, given that he's from that Nashville-like area, and if there's the motive that Sethi might be thought of as the actual conservative, that could cause Hagerty to theoretically do better there.
Well, Nashville is going to be big regardless because both candidates are obviously from the area. Manny Sethi is actually works at Vanderbilt, which is in the heart of Nashville. So that's going to be a pretty big both ways, and there will be a sizable vote even out of Nashville itself. Davidson County, it's a consolidated city county, and Republicans, they don't do terribly there in presidential races. They do have a decent base, and they're well connected and willing to vote. So that's going to be one to look at. I'm going to go ahead and kind of post this article in the comments so some of you can look over it as well. But these are the legislative primaries to watch tonight as well. Like in the rest of the United States, Tennessee has actually seen a bit of a suburban realignment. Williamson County actually trended Democratic strongly from 2012 to 2016. And of course, in Davidson County, which is consolidated with Nashville, they also saw a decline in the vote. So in some of these races, we're seeing primaries that are going to determine whether or not these races can be competitive, specifically in the 20th, the Senate district, where there's a major Democratic primary there to run against an incumbent Republican in a district that actually voted strongly for Phil Bredesen and voted narrowly for Hillary Clinton. That's entirely based in Davidson.
We kind of switched right before I was going to say one last thing, but
go ahead.
Just real quick, touching on the Senate race. I mean, if you look at Bill Lee, and there was not a competitive Senate primary last time in 2018, but there was a competitive gubernatorial primary. Bill Lee did very, very well around the Nashville area, and that converted into a victory against heavily favored Diane Black, who was then a representative from the 6th district. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things go. And I think we should talk about the legislative primaries, but for sure, I recommend that you stay on our Twitter feed. And even though we won't have live coverage of primaries again until next week, I think you're going to enjoy our updates because we're also going to be looking at some of these legislative primaries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's definitely a good thought. And Billy obviously was well known in Nashville. His family was there. He's a businessman. My brother actually lived out in Nashville, and his fiance was adjacent to their property. So it's they're well known. People know him in Nashville. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on there. The one race I really think we need to pay attention to is the Tennessee Senate 20th District. This district stretches around Davidson County, avoiding the core interior of Nashville. It voted for Republicans for quite a while, but managed to vote for Hillary Clinton by the narrowest of margins, while also voting for the incumbent Republican by a slightly smaller margin. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this map up real quick, just to kind of give you a closing thought here before we go off for the night. So if you look at this right here, this is what we're talking about with the suburban realignment. In fact, you can almost see it pretty clearly. If you look at it, basically if you look at a map of Davidson County, it's a pretty typical shape. The center around here is the urban areas of Nashville, which are in other districts. The 20th snakes around the southern areas and then goes around to the north and then to the east. So basically, it has everything but the furthest southeast portion of the county in terms of its design. And this is from Lucas Brooks, who made the map. You'll notice here that Bredesen won this district by almost 20 percentage points, which is a really, really good margin of victory for him. Democrats have a competitive primary there between two candidates, Kimmy Abernathy and Heidi Campbell, both of whom have competitive cash on hand. And whoever wins this district has a very good chance of becoming one of the few Democrats elected in Tennessee in terms of the Senate. They have a very overwhelmingly Republican legislature, even by most Southern legislative standards.
And one thing I think it's important to look at, since we're talking about kind of the fall of the legislative Democrat. I mean, you first had the fall of the presidential Democrat, barring some exceptions, Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton in the South since the Great Switch in 1964. But congressional Democrats lasted for a lot longer. You had some seats start to flip in 94, but most of them managed to last until 2010, and some, like John Barra, until 2014. Now you're starting to see some new candidates in suburbs emerge as Southern Democrats, like Joe Cunningham, for example. But on the legislative level, it continues to this day. There are still rural white Democrats in strongly Republican districts. And I mapped it a long time ago with my old style, but the 41st legislative district in the state house, John Mark Windle, voted for Trump by 75%, but reelected him by 10 points in 2018. And he also won in 2016. Now the Republicans aren't contesting against him. So they didn't nominate a candidate. So that's kind of one of the last seats really represented by a traditional Democrat in the Tennessee legislature.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he really got off easy with Republicans not nominating a candidate against him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting thing to examine in Tennessee, and that's been kind of a sharp divide. Actually, right now, Republicans only have one of the 3 seats in Davidson County. So if they lose the 20th district, they will have lost basically all of the districts in the county. So this is really important one for them to hold on to. Although in terms of the Senate control there, it's not important at all. They have 28 senators at the moment compared to 5 for the Democrats. All of which, if I believe, are in Nashville or in the bigger cities in the state. So places like Memphis as well. So we're going to keep an eye on these as well throughout the night. We'll keep you updated on some of these races, and especially the Senate Republican primary. This is definitely one to keep an eye on if you're interested in primary races, kind of seeing how that conservative versus anti-establishment wings of the party tend to kind of turn out, especially in a race like this, which is actually very similar to Massachusetts, where Joe Kennedy and Joe Kennedy and Ed Markey have very little differences on policy, but much of it is a temperament debate over who is the more progressive of the candidates in terms of temperament, who's going to do certain things along that line. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, this will have already occurred. So you can look on our feed and see what actually happened. But if you're listening to this live, pay attention to our Twitter feed throughout the night. We're not doing live primary coverage just for this, but on Twitter, we will be keeping you posted on what goes out throughout the night. Thanks to Joe Szymanski and some of the other members of our elections team. So with that, I think we're going to close off this episode of Elections Weekly. Thank you for being on. Really appreciate you watching and your support. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to our channel so you can get updated whenever we do future episodes. We do election coverage when primary elections and general elections, special elections happen. We also have 2 weekly shows. We have The Report, which Harrison hosts on Mondays, and we have Elections Weekly, which happens every Thursday, and you're watching it right now, so you probably know what Elections Weekly is. So keep it posted there. We also have these on podcast apps. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can also listen to this on podcast. We have this on Anchor Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Apple Podcast. So, and we upload these pretty shortly after we conclude the episodes. So where can we find you guys on social media for those of you who are just listening?
You can find me at Dylan B. Wade 1 on Twitter. You can find my podcast, Popcorn Politics, on ochelli.com every Tuesday at 6 p.m.
My Twitter is @_Daniel, which is DANEIEL, and then an underscore at the end. I just talk about politics there, and I publish some maps sometimes.
You can find my Twitter at HW Lavelle Maps, and the first 2 letters are capitalized. And I do the head of the elections team at Elections Daily, and I also do mapping of various races and some stuff for the New Jersey Globe. I usually specialize in New Jersey stuff, but I like looking at every state. And even though I normally am not a guest on Elections Weekly, I thought I'd come on tonight just to talk with everyone. So thank you for listening, and we appreciate all of your support for Elections Daily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and keep posted specifically to our election coverage, where we're going to have continued better graphics now, with Harrison having his internet access back following the hurricane, which knocked it out. Our next episode next week of the election coverage will be even better than the one before. So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys next week on next week's edition of Elections Weekly.